Welcome to the Super Gamer Podcast. Welcome to the new Super Gamer Podcast, episode 132. Our guest this week is a PhD student at Concordia, a game designer, co-organizer for Gamerella, and a member of Class and Games, a member of Technoculture, Art and Games, and I'm sure many more things. We have Courtney Blamey. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I love that your bio on Class and Games says, among other things, it says she is interested in serious games, and then it says she is currently playing Animal Crossing.
Yep. It's a really nice dichotomy I've got going there. It was especially because I fully will admit that bio was written right at the start of the pandemic, so Animal Crossing New Horizons had just come out, so I was living and breathing trying to collect all of the fruit trees so I could have all the fruit trees in my Animal Crossing island. So yes, serious games and Animal Crossing.
I was going to ask, does that fall under serious games?
I mean, serious games is a really interesting definition. I've actually just, it's interesting, I'm now technically a PhD candidate, because I passed my proposal defense. So it's a very exciting step up in the whole PhD world.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But there's a big thing about like serious games versus taking games seriously, real games, like what are real games? And so serious games tend to fall into the categories of like news games, which are games that tend to focus on journalistic events. So there's some really well-known one is September 12th, which is, oh gosh, I forget who it's by. I think it's Gonzalo Frasca, which basically is about the aftermath of 9/11. And then there's other games which are like satire games. So there's the McDonald's game by Molly's Industria. And they tend to be trying to persuade you a particular way, trying to teach you a discourse. But then there's also games that have serious themes. So, you could say that The Last of Us is a serious game because it handles a lot of serious themes like grief and loss and the end of the world and, fatherhood in a very weird way. So saying serious games is a super complicated term. It's actually part of what I'm trying to unpack in the presentation. Because taking games seriously versus serious games is a really muddled definition that I think needs some more time pulling apart. So yeah, I think that's there's a lot of different ways. There's like experimental games as well, which can kind of fall under the serious games category. Pippin Bars, oh gosh, it's the one with the rock with Sisyphus, and I forget the name of it now, which is on my committee. But there's so many different ways that games are serious games. That includes the game that I made as part of the Class and Games research project, which was It Comes in Waves. That's another game that we would typically call a serious game because it deals with serious themes, often trying to teach people things at the end of it.
Does a game have to be serious? Because I believe your dissertation research focuses a lot on meaning making in games.
Yeah.
Can only a serious game have meaning making? What is meaning making?
Yeah, no, and so the games that I've chosen are games that aren't necessarily serious games. So one of them, for example, is Life is Strange 2 Colors, which isn't a quote unquote serious game, right? It's a game that looks at the complexity of the spectrum of emotions, showing it emotional manipulation to some degree. And so that, whilst not a serious game, has a lot of meaning making in it. And I'm saying this having not played them yet because that's literally the next stage of my dissertation research. Another one is Spiritfarer. I'm actually not going to include it anymore because I want to get a game in there that doesn't do things successfully. But Spiritfarer being about grief and death, and trying to communicate that to players in different ways through these different stories of the different spirits that you come across during the time. Like, there is meaning making in that. And that's this reciprocal, or essentially what I'm trying to investigate is this reciprocal process between the developers, the representation of it in the game, and then the players. Like, it's this wonderful cyclic back and forth. Plus there's, no game is played or made in a vacuum. So there's all other contexts that happen around this as well. So yeah, the idea that games, like serious games, are the ones to be taken seriously is not true. I think there's a lot of games out there that delve into emotions and deeply meaningful content in ways that is so nuanced and so interesting, and it's why we end up with these games that, you know, can make people cry or can make people angry or can generate a ton of discourse online, right? And we see that, I'd say, like every 3 months there's a game that comes out and everyone's like, oh my goodness, like I'm completely shell-shocked by this, or it's so beautiful, or it's so impressive. And then there's the games that last with people forever, like Journey. I mean, I think Journey's going to be talked about for like the next 2 decades easily for how it really sat with people. And I think a lot of games are trying to go in that direction more and more now, because I think there's a lot of maturity that's happened in the game design world, and there's a lot of people who are trying to make games that communicate something meaningful to them as a developer as well, which I think is really beautiful. For example, for me, like I'm really looking forward to trying to design a game that emulates or helps with self-esteem or represents self-esteem in a variance of mechanics and prototypes, so that players can sit back and really get to reflect on that space and their own sort of feelings about themselves. So yeah.
Well, that leads to, I heard you on the Gamerella podcast. You had been saying that you had a bit of a hard time convincing yourself that you are, in fact, a game designer. You have designed games.
Yeah.
So first off, are you a little better about that now, or how do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think now what I do is I put it in my bios, because then I'm like, now I have to like own it a little bit more and be like, yeah, no, you make games and you're going to continue to make games. And that's kind of things that you like doing. And a big part of this dissertation is that I haven't been able to make games of like what I want to make necessarily. Like, don't get me wrong, the games that I've worked on or the games that I've been alongside, like I've loved the process and it's been something I've been really a part of and I've been included in the creative process. But it's nice to make a game that you're like, this is mine and I'm making this for me a little bit. So I think I've gotten a lot better. I also think that there's a lot of people who are out there who are in the same space who are like, oh, well, I kind of like, you know, I play about in engines and like I design some things, and it's like, no, you're a game designer. Just because you don't have like something on the App Store doesn't mean you're not a game designer. I think it's really important to own that as well, because there's a lot of people out there who are incredibly talented who lack the, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the imposter syndrome, right? Where you just feel like, oh no, but you know, that person's a game designer and they're like way better than me. It's like, no, you can still have a piece of the pie, right? So I think I've gotten much better at it. And I also think that if I can get better at it, then I can help pull people up who were in the same position I was in, where, you know, unsure and not entirely convinced, like what categorizes or classifies you as a game designer is, you know, there's no chart that's in a university on a wall that says you must complete this checklist to be a designer or a game designer. So yeah, much better now, I think. I'd like to think so, at least.
And again, pulling from the Gamerella podcast. So Gamerella, for listeners, is a game jam meant to be inclusive and something that you co-organize, at least in Montreal, I imagine.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I should have known that.
You're all good.
But this is on the podcast. You mentioned as well that this is something that comes up at the game jam, that people do come in thinking, you know, well, I can even say from the one time I was encouraged to get involved, you know, I was like, I don't have any gaming skills, and
yeah,
it does help to have someone there like, hey, you've got this.
Yeah, and that's a really big part of the space as well. I mean, like it's Gina's, you know, absolute love child of like, you know, brainchild rather of really wanting to make a space that is open and welcoming and not intimidating, because game jam spaces really can be, whether that's something that is fostered by accident or just because of like the folks who are in that space, like typical game jams can be really intimidating, and they can emulate, you know, the crunch, like, you know, go through the night, keep working. I mean, I've been parts of like the Global Game Jam, you know, hosted, and when you're a undergrad student, you're like, I'm just not going to sleep, and that's such a good idea. And luckily we had professors who were like, go to bed, you're insane. The sky will be there to worry about in the morning, like go home. And so the whole thing with Gamerella is really trying to push this rhetoric and this discourse of inclusivity, making folks feel welcome, assuring folks, like, if you make a game and it doesn't work at the end of the jam, you've still learned something over the last 48 hours that you wouldn't have without it. And, if you come away with a really cool sprite you've animated, that's great. You're going to go in and do that again next time, and it's going to be even easier. And it is like, it's so daunting for people who are coming into it with like very little, and then, they might be put in a team with folks who have, maybe 50 hours in an engine. So they are going to seem a lot more skilled at what they're doing, but they're also in the same boat thinking, well, someone might have 100 hours. So yeah, it's a really big point of making sure that folks know, like, you have to come in at some point. Like, you're not like, there's never going to be a good time to start this. So start now and start in a space that's going to lift you up and help you. And we have mentors as well, which has been a really wonderful thing to include, where we have industry professionals who are there basically being like, this is awesome, keep going. Or like, this is like, here's how we can help you make this better. Or like, this is what I recommend you as a resource. And I think that's so valuable to very early stage game developers, game artists, game animators, programmers. It's just that little step up of like, it's not a baptism by fire type situation. It's more of a like, a gentle dip into like a nice sauna type situation.
It's funny to me, I'm not a game developer or anything like that, so maybe I'm just removed, but when I first saw a game jam, like in person, like I was covering it, it really struck me as like, oh, it's like a LAN party, cool, where, people are going to be up all night, and that seemed like fun to me. And then as I, learned more, I'm like, oh, well, there's a huge issue with crunch in the industry, and probably you don't want to be encouraging that.
Well, there is a thing of like the novelty, like if you're doing it like once, then like, there is a thing of like, we're going to stay up till like 1 a.m. then we're going to sleep, we're going to get up at 8. Like, there's that element to it. And it is like a LAN party. Like, it's like basically a big nerdy sleepover where you get pizza and you code and you make things and you try things and, you come out hopefully with some kind of semblance of a game or a prototype or a wireframe at the end of it. And it is meant to be fun, I think, is the big part of it too. And I think that's something else we try and foster with Gamerella is like, if things start going wrong and if the tech isn't working, don't panic. Like it's not a competition. You're saving lives. This is for you to get some experience. And if you come away with something that kind of works, that's fine. That's so great. That's leagues ahead of where you were. And so, yeah, the fun and the LAN party of it, which I think is a great comparison, is something that's really worth keeping. And like, it's been hard to, because we've done mostly online Gamerellas for the last 2 years. So we did Gamerella Global and then the first online edition before that. And it's difficult to kind of make that atmosphere via the online space and Discord space. Like, you can do different affordances with it, like hosting a global game jam. Well, not a global game jam, but Gamerella Global, because, you can work in different time zones when you're doing it online. But the in-person version of it is a lot more like, we can offer childcare if there's older folks who are wanting to get into the games industry and they're like, this is my starting point. Or we can provide tech to people who may not have the income to afford the tech that they need and all that jazz. So there's a lot of different things that come with it, and like a really good feminist intersection framework that gets applied to it as well, so that we are trying to be inclusive. And we may not always get it right, but we always take the next step to improve on it where we might get it wrong too.
Which is actually my next question. What have you, as far as being inclusive, what should anyone who's going to start their own game jam, like, what should they keep in mind? And what did you get into and go, oh, we didn't even think of that and we should have?
Yeah. So a big part of it was, so my advice is usually think about where you're advertising it, is a big thing, because if you specifically don't it's always a really dangerous game, ironically, to be like, well, so when you want like global majority folks, BIPOC folks, LGBTQIA plus folks, like, you can actively advertise for that, but you might still get folks who aren't from communities who are just like, this seems like a really nice game jam. And you do have to sit back and ask, like, are we still going to open that space to them? Are we going to make sure that that's a smaller population? Like, there's a lot of questions to ask about it. The thing that we hadn't prepared for, I think, was like when we did the Gamerella Global, it was realizing how many different cultures were going to be overlapping. And so we needed to write, usually have like a code of conduct, like a rules of the space. And it was just a thing of like, be understanding that like different cultures express themselves in different ways. And like, not that we had any examples or anything, it was just a thing of like, try to be understanding and don't jump to the most negative conclusions first, I guess, is kind of the approach we took, just because there's like so many different people from so many different backgrounds, and it's like, you know, they're not going to all act in the same way. And so we need to be cognizant of that. And so that was one of the things we wanted to be really mindful of, so that no one felt stigmatized or shunned because they didn't have particular phrasing right, especially if there was like so many international folks who English wasn't their first language. And the other thing was accessibility was a huge thing for us. Not that we were kind of not prepared for it, but it was like the time we needed to take and make sure we had to ensure that all of our online stuff was accessible as possible in terms of captioning, live captioning, transcripts, writing out scripts so people could follow along and read, alt text on different things we were posting, and then actually some of our participants into account, like color blindness when they were designing games, or making alternative controls so that someone who has limited mobility can use, you know, just the space bar or the WASD keys or something like that. So yeah, I think we also have a handbook is the other thing too, and we're actually trying to update it at some point for online game jams about like the things to consider when doing this as well, because it is things shift, phrasing shift, the correct terminology shifts, what's expected of spaces shifts on, you know, a 6-month to a year basis. And I think it's important to give learning space to folks, and a graciousness, but also being okay to flag it is another thing. Like every time or any time a participant flags something to us, we've been grateful, because it's constantly a learning experience, and there are ways to call in instead of call out, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think it's a good kind of tough because it keeps you on toes. But I think if you care and you're worrying about it, then you're probably doing as much as you can already, if that makes sense. Like the amount of stress that would be going through us as organizers meant like it's because we care and we want to get this right. And I think that's another part of it too, that you can kind of pat yourself on the back as well. Because if you're just like, I'll be fine, maybe you should be a little bit worried. Like, I'm not saying anyone should be having like an anxiety attack trying to run these things, but like a little bit of anxiety never hurt nobody. It's right, you know?
This definitely fits your description in Discord here, professional overthinker.
Exactly, 100%. So I like to think, I overanalyze things. It's literally in my job description. So.
What's your favorite idea to ever come? I should say, one of the things you do, you brainstorm with the other organizers before each event, and you call it the huddle. So what's your favorite idea to ever come out of the huddle, whether you used it or not?
Oh, God, what was... Oh, I'm not going to be able to remember it now, but it was like I don't know if it was like a phrasing that we tried to translate across from like Finnish or something like that, but it was like something bacon, and it was like the idea of like smells. I can't remember, but it was like something really obscure, because when we do this Gamerella huddle, it's not just for the theme, we also have modifiers. And so modifiers can be things like use all the colors of the rainbow, or you know, make the sound effects like from your own like vocals. And so one of them was bacon. We didn't use it, but we put it on the burner for like the next year because it just made us laugh so much. But we were like, it's going to detract from like the actual theme, which I think that year was normal because it was like during the pandemic, and we're like, what is quote, and how weird normal was, and normal not being the same. But yeah, I think it was something bacon, and I can't remember what it was. It's driving me crazy, and I'm going to have to look it up after this. But yeah, that was definitely one of the ones that made us all chuckle a lot, because we were just like, that's an amazing modifier.
So moving on to some of your writing, between Top Shelf Drinks, Bottom Line Play, examining representations of class in bartending and mixology games, All in a Day's Work, Working Class Heroes as Video Game Protagonists, and If These Drinks Could Speak, Class and Labor in Valhalla. I'm just going to call it Valhalla.
Yeah, it's Valhalla.
And Coffee Talk. You have written a lot on bartender games. What is it about those games that's such an interesting topic for you?
Do you know, it was one of those things where we sort of divvied up different like service industry work and labor. And so my different colleagues, there was firefighting, there was janitorial work, taxi driving, and then bartending. And so I kind of took on the bartending, and it just really resonated with me how the narrative, or then the drink making, was the narrative for the player. And it just, something about it really spoke to me, and that's why I managed to write so much with it, because I just found it really, really interesting. And then I collaborated with my colleague Scott as well on the, like, again, like how narrative representation in drinking games helps or hinders, you know, class representations and cultural representations. And yeah, I don't know, like maybe it was just because I kind of like the cozy bartending game a little bit as well during the time I was playing it. And also Valhalla is a wonderfully weird game to play as well. It's got like, you serve drinks to a corgi at one point, which thoroughly checks my like games I like to play box, because it's hilarious and weird. But yeah, it was really about how these games represent service industry work, and especially how many of them are like cyberpunk, because like the dystopian, like everyone's a gig economy worker now type thing is alarming and impending, I think, to some degree. But it was, yeah, it just, something about it really just helped elaborate on what we were trying to tap into, which is like these games, like I don't even know what I'm trying to say, but like these bartending games really show the misery, I think, of service work in the dive bar situation. I just thought there was so much to be said about it, and the emotional labor behind it as well. Like it's typically like, you know, a lot of them tend to be female bartenders, and there's the whole idea of like the bartender is the poor man's therapist as well. And so a lot of class markers come through with that, and I just thought it was supremely interesting for the Class and Games project as a result.
So maybe I misunderstood some while reading it, because it seemed like you were, to me anyway, it seemed like you were also saying that there's a romanticism as far as the labor, and especially you differentiate between labor and creative labor. And it sounded like you were kind of saying like maybe these games aren't exploring like you have to work to live, right? Like it isn't just like, oh look, I've made this beautiful drink and that's why I do it. Like,
yeah, well, this is the thing. This is where like you have to go from being the player to being the analyzer. Yeah. Conducting the analysis, basically, where you go, oh, this is like a cozy bartending game. It's like a rainy cityscape. And then you're like, oh, I have to make rent in this game. Like, and then it just comes out of nowhere. And this is the thing that like Scott in my paper touches on, which is the idea of like there's this romanticism of like, you know, everyone makes fun and makes the meme of like the artisanal, you know, cocktail, the mixologist. And the bottom line is they are very much the same as the bartender who, you know, a chain of bars are here, but because we have the Weatherspoons in the UK, so it's the one I think of. But like there's no pay difference really there, and you know, you work for tips, and it is this like idea of like the creative labor obscures the class labor that happens there, and the class precarity and the economic precarity as well on top of that. So you didn't misunderstand. It's just that there's these different layers that are happening, and obviously there's multiple different papers, so my brain is split between three. But yeah, there is that element as well, which is this idea of creative labor. And I mean, even like, God, whenever there's a game that's about like, there probably already is one about being an influencer and how that's like, you know, all very glamorous and very cool and very trendy. But the bottom line is like, the number of people who are quote unquote influencers are probably not making a lot of money and are putting in a lot of time to hopefully make their way up the chart. It's like a pyramid scheme. It's terrifying. But yeah, there's I would love to see more quote occupational games, I guess, of like service industry work or different industry work, and how it deals with it and either tries to ignore the class side of things or leans into it without realizing, or just really satirizes it. which is kind of the example we've seen across all the different games played in the project.
While reading that paper, it was funny to me. So half my family's Irish, and my uncle was a bartender for years. And it's funny to me that pouring a good pint doesn't seem to be a creative labor when, that's such a big deal.
And let me tell you, I have worked in bars myself, and if you pour a pint wrong, they will tell you. It is a science and an art, especially if you're pouring in, I mean, for Ireland, it's Guinness, got to get that right. But it is interesting what, the idea of, what is an art and what is just you doing, the work. I mean, this is the comparison between Tapper, which is the arcade game where you're trying to get out as many drinks as possible and you have to get, your clients satiated and then maybe collect tips and try not to get thrown out of the bar, versus this mixologist game where you're curating this emotional experience and it unlocks parts of the story for you. And it's a very different comparison of the same job. So yeah, very different. And pulling a pint is definitely an art and should not be not.
Going down a different road as far as things you've written, bringing down the ban hammer, understanding the impact of competitive players on moderation tactics in Overwatch.
Yeah.
Definitely a super interesting topic to me, and I mentioned in an email to you. It kind of overlaps with something I was just talking to my friend about, I think.
Yeah.
He's a delightful fella, but he has been banned in League of Legends 3 times.
Oh, no.
He talks about how, well, when you get banned or when you're reported enough, they put you in ELO hell.
Yep.
And then, you're surrounded by other people like that, and it's impossible to get your rank up, and you're stuck there, blah, blah, blah. And it got me wondering, what... Because League of Legends is such a competitive game. Overwatch, as you point out in the paper, has a major competitive aspect, although it's a lot of casual as well. But
yeah,
the competitiveness, I started thinking about, you see soccer players, yell at each other, you didn't give me the ball when you should have, and we kind of accept that because they're at the top of their game, right? So, should there be any of that in competitive video games, or...
I actually was I thought this was such a good question because... especially ELO Hell is the immediate equivalent of the sin bin, I guess, where you get put in timeout and it's you have to go sit with everyone else who couldn't behave themselves. It's the naughty step of online gaming. But what's really funny is I have friends who play Dota, and if you are really good, and I'm talking good in skill, but also good is in behavior, you're not getting banned left, right, and center. You also get into this weird queue of you are put with the new players if you're not playing rank, where they're you can shepherd them into not hell but Dota, into the toxic swamp, as my friend Mark Lajeunesse has written his MA thesis on, is on Dota and the toxicity there, and I actually trialed playing Dota for a week as his one of his research subjects, and I was why are they pinging me? I don't understand. Turns out it was really bad. Which is to be expected, having had 2 tutorials which were 15 minutes long, and then they were okay, go play a game now, and you're no wonder everyone hates players.
Those MOBA games are complicated.
They are, and the onboarding for them is basically they kind of show you 2 heroes. They're this is how you aggro, this is how you support, this is how you carry, good luck. And you're I don't understand anything that just happened. I just clicked the things you told me to, and now everyone's yelling at me because I don't know how to play. But this is one of the things with Overwatch, which is my contention, and this really came from my favorite thing about this entire MA thesis, and the fact that I've even now written obviously a chapter on it from my MA thesis, was that this totally came about because I was playing Lucio in a match, or Mercy in a match, and someone was just being, I assume swearing's fine on this podcast, because someone's being a real dick to me basically in game, and they were what is our Lucio doing, do X, Y, Z, and I was I'm just playing the game, dude, calm down. And for me, I was why, I'm in quick play, why am I being told how to play, and not in a way that's constructive or advisory. It was just what are you doing? And I was just leave me alone. And so that's where it was born, because I basically went, I think that there is a contention between the casual players, the amateur players, And then the competitive, aspiring professional, and like maybe semi-professional players, the entire population being plonked into essentially quick play, where like the queuing just seems, I mean, as far as I remember, like random for like who got queued into what. It was gonna just make hell for everyone, because everyone was going in with different expectations of how play was going to be. So to your question of like, is there a place for like this idea of, you know, like you should have like, you know, given me the ball, like, you know, or like you should have, I don't know, picked this hero because of the meta and stuff like that. Like there is an element of that. And I think that belongs in competitive play, which is not what quick play is, or like quick queue or whatever, which is where I think like, you know, the casuals go, which is, you know, Waves me. Like, I'm not playing to be competitive because I don't want that high stake game. Do I still care about winning? 100%. And am I going to try and do my best? Yes. But am I going to like scroll the forums and like watch all the videos and like sink that time, which I don't have, into like being like, well, clearly the meta states that I should be playing this because otherwise. And then I'm like, no, I'm going to pick this hero because I enjoy playing this hero and I think it works well with the team comp, and go from there. And if people get mad at me, they should go and queue in competitive, where they can get mad at people for that, because that's where you should know the meta and like the, you know, what the most efficient way to play the game is, to some degree. I mean, there's, you know, you can only be so efficient as your skill level is, but that's another problem.
It is, I feel a bit for the developers here in that, like, you don't want, obviously, someone who plays competitive, if you want to have a casual game, go ahead, right? Like, so then, but then the policing there has to fall on the players themselves. You have to keep yourself in check, right? Like, how can you possibly moderate that as a developer?
And this is the huge problem that arises from it. And like part of my argument was that like a lot of these issues arise from like, there was kind of like a division that I highlighted, which is, and it's kind of after the fact of the thesis, but it's been a lot of reflection with us also talking to friends of mine who play League, who play Dota, who play Overwatch, either competitive or casual or whatever, which is, you have like the social moderation side of things. So you have like, you know, abuse over comms, you know, racism, sexism, homophobia, slurs. That's like its own box of like needs to be moderated. And then you have like the mechanics that need moderating. And I say that in terms of like where like looking for group comes in, as I kind of coined it, a moderation tool, because people who were queuing into games and just getting pissed that like it wasn't working out for them because the team that they were queuing in with wasn't what they were looking for, wasn't what they were hoping from it. That's where looking for group came in and was like, okay, you want people who are like going for gold, going for platinum, maybe will want to queue into a quick play, but like will still expect a level of good play and high like understanding and skill level of the game. Great. Looking for group is for you. And even avoid as teammate to some degree, but you can also use that for like both, which is part of the rhetoric was like, well, I'm just going to avoid everyone who plays Hanzo because I hate Hanzo, versus like, I'm going to avoid this guy because he was slinging slurs at everyone in the chat and I really didn't want to be a part of that. So there's a lot of crossover there too, but it's not an easy task. Like I really, like part of me was like, Blizzard has a ton of money and could put a lot more research into this and probably unpack a lot more how to better moderate this space. But moderating an online space is awful. It is so difficult. I have a friend of mine who was a community moderator, a community manager for a studio, and it is just like, it is a like 24/7 job. And it's a lot of emotional labor. It is a lot of constantly putting out fires. And, you know, there's only so much you can do, I do think, until there's just a point of like I said, there is an element of self-policing, which is where like endorsements came in, but then like people were just kind of giving endorsements without thinking about it. Because a really big part of my conclusions from like players taking on these moderation tools and looking at them and going, well, we're going to use it like X, and the developers being like, but we wanted you to use it like Y, is like sometimes they're just not effective because players will take them and kind of use them how they want. And that's how, when they had the avoid player, which was like the predecessor to avoid as teammate mechanic, there was a huge number of people who avoided a top-ranked Widowmaker to the point where the player who was like a pro player could not queue into a game because of how many people had avoided him at like the level that he was at. And so then they had to remove the tool because they were like, well, it doesn't work when everyone avoids a player because they don't want to get sniped because player's really good. So it creates all these weird, wonderful, like, social issues and, like, player expectations that all, like, meld into this weird mess of, like, all this varying expectation and understanding and reception of these tools. And that's why it becomes just basically a big clusterfuck of, oh God, what do we do with this? And kind of my come away from that was like, I don't think it's completely at loss, but like there is definitely a more argument. And this has been something that's talked by TL Taylor and I'm gonna Nick Banks. I can't remember. It's gonna come to me at some point. But they basically talk about like co-creation and co-governance as like a way to. So this is like the self-policing, but you kind of do it in tandem with your developers, where you maybe have tools that are made, but you actually communicate with your players. You basically host like town halls to be like, what do you need? And like, how do we do it? Because clearly what we're putting in isn't working or something isn't sitting right. And it'd be better to get the feedback from the community. And this was part of the dissertation too, was being like, are people actually suggesting the tools that they put in place? Which wasn't really the case.
Right.
But yeah.
I found it amazing, the avoid a teammate part. You said there was a max of 2 people you could avoid, and then they raised it to 3, and that's amazing to me because I'm back into World of Warcraft Classic, and
Wonderful.
I understand that for some people just muting or blocking, that's not fixing it. For me, I'm just in a place where if you say anything I don't want to hear it. You're just blocked.
Yeah.
But I found it, World of Warcraft, I think it was 60 people. Like, that's how quick I'm just like, I'm not dealing with that. But I got to 60, and then it was like, you can't do it anymore. And I was furious. I was like, why are you telling me who I can and can't? Like, and the idea that you could have 2, I mean, that's doing nothing. Well,
this is the thing, right? And, like, I think the thing is there's, like, a decay time on it where, like, if it's after a week or 2 weeks, it, like, I think you have to avoid them as well, from what I remember. And so it just seemed like a bit of a, like, it was a band-aid solution, right? Because then you could end up queuing in with them like 3 weeks later and they're still the same toxic player that you were dealing with before. And there was, like, so one of the conference presentations I did was literally called like mute block report, because I did like a general survey of the Overwatch forum on like how do people feel about toxicity in the space, and like especially because Overwatch was like heralded in its like beta and like early 2-3 months as being this really positive space and really fun space, and then competitive play came in and everything changed. So I just really thought it was just so depressing, because I was like, that's just such a nice community. Like, second you put stakes into place, everyone gets mad at each other. But where was I going with this? But yeah, so like the mute block report was like essentially a forum post I came across where they were like, the way you deal with it is you mute them, you block them, you report them, and you move on. Like, that's just like, why is everyone making this more complicated than it has to be? And it's like, because we don't see it reflected in the system. And of course now, like, reportings, like, you get in Overwatch, I believe, feedback now when a report has actually had an action taken on it. Which I think is helpful, because it means that you feel like you're not just throwing a report into the system for like no idea whether they're going to continue behaving the way they were or not. But yeah, I do understand the mute block report, because it's also like, you don't have to type out a report every time. Like, it's if you did that for 60 people, you wouldn't be able to play the game.
Right. Well, and also, would I be wrong in thinking, in my mind, ultimately, what I think a company needs to do, and I am sure this is, at least in their minds, prohibitively expensive, but it's staff, right? Like, you need people to be able to actually examine the report and see what happened, and then make a decision. So, yeah, I mean, like you said, one community manager, that would be unbearable. Like, you need a major staff to be able to do that.
You need an entire department of people who can review these things, and like, you can automate it to some degree, but like, there was like a really good forum post that I really loved, and it resonated with me a lot, which was talking about like how there was, a category for the reporting, which was like abuse over comms or something like that. And they basically said like, surely like there is a difference between like straight up slurs in chat and like someone just being like super rude, and that still be classing as like abuse over comm. And they were like, I really would like to see like it doesn't have to be in the front end, but in the back end, some kind of like tier situation. But then like that gets super complicated because then like how do you categorize it? But they were basically saying like, you know, if someone calls me a racial slur, I would want that dealt with sooner and more swiftly or more harshly than someone just like bothering people over like, you know, telling everyone that they're trash, right? They're like, that's two very different versions of abuse over comm. And I was like, yeah, that's totally like, that's bang on, because that's the thing. When you categorize it so widely, then, you know, everyone just, so is it a slap on the wrist? Is it like, and that's why like, you know, human opinion comes into it as well. And then you've got subjectivity, and there's no perfect solution, but yeah, you would need like an entire department of people, because if you consider how many millions of people are active in a game at one time, it's a lot, because there's a high population of them who are not very nice to play with.
Yeah. Well,
unfortunately.
Speaking of comms, what is to be done about voice chat? You get into this in the paper, and like, really, just, like, nobody wants to be recorded.
Yeah. Well, this is the other thing, right? Like, if you're going to police those spaces, like, you know, there's this weird thing in like the end user license agreement. I don't know if it's still in, but like, it's like all of your chat logs are technically owned by Blizzard because it happens in that space. And like, that's a super surreal thing. And so then people were like, well, why do we have it so like it like runs through like and does transcriptions of your like chats, and then like you know talking over the mics, and then that way if like someone's like being super like awful, then I was like, I understand the reasoning behind that, but like that is a super scary precedent to set of this idea that you're constantly being, I mean, like we all joke that like all of our devices are listening to us anyway, but like there is a very different thing of like that particular scenario. And it's sad because like there's a lot of games that people just won't turn on voice comms. So like, what is the point? All that's going to happen is I'm going to get yelled at. And like there are plenty of cases where like Black folks and women have just been like, I am just not turning on my microphone, because the second they hear me, they will immediately assume, and then they will just be awful to me. And it still goes on, and it's so stupid that it's still the case.
It's horrible to the point that I get mad at a game that doesn't have a quick. I think every game with voice chat should have a very quick mute all button.
1000%.
Like, because yeah, I like Rocket League. I play a lot, and maybe there is one, but I can't find it. And I'm just like, why do I need to? I'm not here to talk to you. I don't want to hear any of the bad stuff. I don't even really want to hear the good stuff.
Just want to be here to play my game. Well, this was like the crazy thing, because there's this element of like, you know, when it came out on console, there was no report system on the console for like, oh God, I'm going to forget how long now. I think it was like 3-4 months, or like maybe it was even longer. I think it was like a year or something like that you couldn't report people on the console. And it was like on the console version of Overwatch. And I was like, that is so messed up, because then like you're just dealing with like a year of like toxicity festering in the space with absolute. And like, I think you could like go into the client and like do it, but that would mean like you get up from your match, you go to your laptop, you type in Blizzard report system, you put in your code, and it's just like, that's not like the same. Whereas now obviously it's a lot streamlined, a lot more easier. But yeah, there should just be, in fact, I honestly think the default in most games should be the mic is muted. Like, just everything is muted from the get-go. Because most people, I would love to see, like, the data that shows, like, how many people actually have their mic open and active, like, on when they're playing a game.
I've definitely had a few times where I'm like, oh no, they can hear me, and I've been, like, burping.
Yeah. Well, it's like someone who's clearly forgotten their mic is on, and they're, like, eating chips really loud into it, and it's just like, this is awful.
Before we get off this subject, I did want to talk about the whole meta thing. World of Warcraft is my basis for this, but I don't see a way around this. It's probably more my problem, but the idea of min-maxing in every game now is so frustrating to me. Like Warcraft, if you want to get in a raid, well, you have to be this kind of character. It's like, well, then why do we have all these different skill trees if I just have to be this every time? And, you know, you could say the same for Overwatch, where it's like, well, I want to experiment a bit, but there's no room for that.
Yeah. No, this is something that I think is a really big problem, and I think it's just like, I don't know if it's a numerical game design thing. I don't know if it is like thing is, it almost is like a game in itself where people basically try and crack the code of like what is the most efficient way to play this game, which is the min-maxing thing, which is like, it is a problem solving thing, and it really scratches people's brains in a particular way that it just like, it is super satisfying once you kind of crack it. You're like, this is like the top build. This is like the most damage per second I can get. And like, that is fascinating, but it leaves no room for any other players, or like, I don't want to play the optimal build. Maybe I want to play the really pretty build that looks really fun and does like 2/3 of the damage, but my gosh, do I have fun playing it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's such a problem that I honestly don't know how they fix it, unless they balance everything in a way where like all the damage is the same and all of this is the same, but then it's like, well, then like there's no nuance there for like,
I actually think Warcraft fell into that problem. I don't know where it's at now. Like I say, I play Classic because that's what I did, and what kind of got me out of it was when it first launched, there was like, well, I mean, a rogue is going to kill a mage, but a mage would kill a warrior, and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And then they just kept trying to make it more and more just everything's the same, and I was like, well, then there's no reason to be here.
And that's the thing, like, it is just like the advantages and disadvantages of a class, of a particular build, like that balancing like is not easy to do. I think a lot of people will say like, oh, well, if they just did this, that, and the other, and it's like, yeah, but there's like 15 more heroes, like if you're in Dota or League, that you have to consider on top of that. And I think almost that's like there is obviously like a meta for League and Dota and MOBAs like that, but there's also like 70 heroes, so there's enough mixture that like, while some obviously have become like the F tier heroes and some of them become the S tier heroes, like there is still like a bit of space to like play something different to like match what you're against. But like when you have a smaller pool of classes or a smaller pool of heroes like you do in Overwatch, especially when you then have role queue, which is like, you can't play outside of this meta anymore because it just broke our game, so now we're just making it a feature. It is so hard then to like go beyond that, because it's just like, well, of course this is the optimal build, and that's it. Like there's no, and that's when you end up with people getting cross at other people in a game because they're like, why did you pick this hero? Because like clearly they're not the better one. And it's just like, because I wanted to play it. Like, damn, let me live my life. It's my downtime. I don't need to be like constantly optimizing myself. It's a dichotomy of people who love that side of games, the min-maxing and the unpacking how to do it, and the people who want to play the pretty build. And I don't think there's a world where they can both exist and be happy yet. Someone might crack it, and if they do, I think they need a Nobel Peace Prize for gaming, because like it would be a hell of an undertaking, but it's really tough. It's really, really tough.
I am led to believe that there are min-maxers in Dungeons & Dragons, and that is so strange to me.
There is 100% min-maxers in Dungeons & Dragons, and in I play Pathfinder, 2nd edition, and I can promise you, because I play with one, not in a way that's like detrimental to the gameplay, but when they make builds, like they really think through like how the most optimal version of that is, then like the more, and like they still like add, like one of them adds still flavor to it, and so it makes sense, and others are just like, no, this is like the most cleanest optimal damage per second or most shield that I can get with my AC. And it is so fascinating to watch as someone who's like, I am going to play a swashbuckler.
Right.
And she is a genie. And so therefore I would like some watery spells, and I want a cool sword. And like, that's kind of where I start from. Rather than being like, where is my damage coming from? And what is my output? And et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I played with a lot. I don't really play anymore, just timing, whatever. But
yeah,
I think our group would get really mad at someone who was like always doing well.
Yeah. Well, the problem is as well, then the DM is like, oh, you've got a really high output and high damage character. Cool. I'm just going to raise the challenge level, which means that everyone else is like, oh god, we're getting crushed. And this one player is just like blasting through it. And then eventually you realize like, maybe this isn't the most fun for everyone. But like, to be fair, that's like, I would say in my games, like it's been a good balance between, because I mean, there is also still randomization because you still have to roll a dice. Whereas when you look at your games like Dota and League and WoW and stuff like that, like there is less of a dice roll, there's less RNG in your hits, because if that was the case, I think people would lose their mind trying to play those games.
How would one min-max It Comes in Waves?
Oh god. Just click through the story without paying attention to it until you get to the end, I guess. Try and make all the best choices as you can, or just literally go into the back end of the twine and figure out where we've hidden all the values.
No, but obviously I'm kidding, but I did play that today, and what I really loved is how... I loved the way you spaced things. Like, it was very poetic, like that, the one part where it's like, she's washing her hands, and it's like 20, 19, 18, you have to click, and then, 17, 16, 15, you have to click, and then there'd be other parts that weren't even really unlocked until you did the menial tasks, like, very cool.
Yeah, it kind of embraced, like, the mundanity of everything, but also, like, how weirdly overwhelming, like, the very start of the pandemic was. And it was super weird to design as well, because we had to go back to, like, March when it kicked off in at least in Montreal, for like, oh yeah, like they were like, don't worry about wearing masks, like save the PPE for like the healthcare workers for like 2.5, 3 months. And we're like, oh my gosh, that's right. And then like mask wearing was like, you should be wearing a mask. And it was like the rhetoric changing. Oh my gosh, like trying to keep up with that and like living it at the same time whilst designing the game was the most surreal, like it's like the meme of Charlie Day from It's Always Sunny where he's like pointing at like who is Pep. It's just like, this is like House trying to unpack like the map of when was hand washing a thing, when was cleaning your groceries a thing, like when did like mask, it's so complicated. When did people start wearing gloves? Super bizarre, but super interesting design.
Yeah, and people can still check that out on itch.io?
Yes, they can. It's, I think, miaconsalvo.itch.io/itcomesinwaves.
I can also find it through the Class and Games website.
Yes, which is classandgames.com.
All right, we're pretty much winding down. I did want to ask, though, you interned at Octopus 8 Studios?
Yes.
And do they exist anymore? I tried finding them.
So it's an interesting thing where it is basically a summer internship program that is set up at university. It's Brunel University in London, and it is the professors there, the lecturers there, own this game studio, and it's essentially a way for them to give students like a chance to make a game. So it's kind of like a really long form game jam. It's like I think 6 weeks, 7 weeks. And you start with like your team. You have a producer, an artist, a programmer, a designer, and then you do another designer. And then you basically set up and make a game over 6 weeks. And so that's like the purpose of it. So it's not so much like it's not like you're interning at Ubisoft or interning at Mediatonic or anything like that. It's very much set up as a like summer project type deal, but it's done under a studio, which is great because then you get experience doing like a development cycle, and like they also have industry experience to help with that as well. So it's a very cool program that they run for students to get experience basically in a semester where usually, at least in England, like you don't really have classes over the summer semester and most people kind of float away. So it gives folks a purpose to kind of get to make a game and publish it to the App Store, which is awesome.
What game did you do?
I did Island Foretold, which I would say now on reflection is very culturally appropriative, and I think if I were to do it again, I would not do it. As like a full disclaimer, but the thing is like you come away with an App Store publication, and my main takeaway from it was like I managed to get a lot of eyes on it, which was like a pat on the back. But now it's like it's very much based around like Maori culture and things like that, and it was not our place to be doing it. So it's one that I would not recommend people go and play. It is definitely lost to the time of the App Store, and I think because it hasn't been updated in like 5 years, I don't think it's even on there anymore. But it is a lesson in how things change and how what is appropriate at one time will not become appropriate at a later time. So it has definitely been something that I have carried forward into any teaching spaces I've had with students or design spaces that I've helped support, like Gamerella, where I'm like, try and think through like what this is doing. Are you tokenizing? Are you appropriating the culture? Like, is this your story to tell? It's a moment that you can learn and grow from.
And then I'll end with, considering I imagine video games are basically everything you do for work at this point, how do you wind down?
That's a really good question. It's kind of like a joke in our research lab where like you have games for like work and then games for fun, because I love games. I would not be doing this if I didn't love them in some capacity. So I have a list of games that I play for fun. I also wind down. I love watching Critical Role. I haven't started Campaign 3 yet. Well, I started it and then I moved back to Campaign 2 because I was like, I really just finished the second one and then get back into it. I tend to opt for like a lot of it's like the quote wholesome cozy games that are like, so Bear and Breakfast was one that I played recently that was just so endearing. If a little bit shallow at times, I found like I wasn't sure like what more was going on with it, but I think that's like one of those rolling update type games. And I also play typically I play Pathfinder or I'll DM Pathfinder session, which is a really good way to wind down as well. So there's definitely times where I've like overdone it on the game side of things. Either I've been playing them for work or I've been analyzing them. And that's not to say that the analysis brain doesn't switch off. I feel like it must be the same for people who do like film degrees or, literary studies or whatever. Like once you have that mindset, like it doesn't really switch off. And I think actually one of the first things one of our lecturers said to us in our undergrad was like, this degree is going to ruin games for you because you're not going to be able to switch your design brain off ever again. And he was totally correct, because now every time I play a game, I'm like analyzing it in the back of my brain. I'm like, shh, this is a fun game. This is a game for fun. Be quiet.
Well, you're taking it seriously.
I am indeed taking it seriously. Very good.
Where can people find Courtney Blamey?
I am primarily on Twitter, with hopefully a website coming in the next few months. Is something that's been on the to-do list for a while. But yeah, find me. It's just at Courtney Blamey on Twitter.
Courtney Blamey, thank you so much.
Thank you.